Steve Morse is not loud, not rebellious, yet every time he touches the guitar, the entire room seems to hold its breath. The man who always stands on the far right, quiet, blonde hair falling over his face, never tries to claim anyone's attention. But when his guitar begins to sing, the audience stops breathing. He plays every note with his heart, turning silence into a language stronger than any declaration. He never smashed amplifiers or set stages on fire. He is a sound architect, the one who kept Deep Purple from falling apart, brought Kansas back to the Billboard charts, and turned Dixie Dregs into a symbol of 70s fusion. Yet behind those extraordinary hands lies a body worn down by pain. He once practiced 10,000 notes a day, made the entire Montreux Jazz Festival rise to its feet, then vanished at the height of his fame as if he had never existed. No scandals, no farewell, only silence, and the kind of music that leaves people in awe and sorrow. So why would a genius who had everything choose to disappear? Not because of failure, not from exhaustion, but because sometimes there are battles only the artist can hear within his own music. This isn't just the story of a great guitarist. It's the journey of a man who used music to fight time, pain, and oblivion. And once you truly understand Steve Morse, you'll never listen to the guitar the same way again. Steve Morse was born in 1954 in Hamilton, Ohio, a quiet little town where church bells were more familiar than rock music. His father was a minister, a man who believed in discipline and restraint, while his mother was gentle but firm, a woman of few words. In that household, music wasn't entertainment. It was ritual. The air was filled with solemn hymns, not the Beatles, not Hendrix, not the Rolling Stones. Yet it was within those restrictions that the first seed of sound was planted in Steve. The ability to hear beauty in silence, to find meaning in pauses that others ignored. While his father preached, young Steve would secretly pluck the strings of an old guitar, trying to create sounds unlike anything he'd heard in church. At night, he hid a small transistor radio under his pillow, turning the volume down low to catch forbidden rock songs. That was when he realized freedom didn't live in anyone's sermons. It lived in the sound that made his heart tremble. The Morse family moved often, from Ohio to Tennessee, then to Ypsilanti, Michigan. For the introverted boy, music became his only friend, the one that listened without judgment. When he began growing his hair long and playing at school parties, music stopped being a hobby. It became a declaration of rebellion, a way to break free from every mold that tried to contain him. At 16, Steve was expelled from school for one reason only. He refused to cut his hair. In an era when long hair symbolized rebellion, he was branded a moral threat. Yet that expulsion, which could have ruined his future, became his first turning point. An art school discovered his talent and offered him a place, even though he hadn't finished high school. Instead of turning back, Steve Morse walked forward, straight into the University of Miami, one of the nation's most respected music schools, where every student carried the same burning dream: to change the world through sound. Among future legends like Jaco Pastorius, the genius bassist of Weather Report, and Pat Metheny, the man who revolutionized modern jazz guitar, Steve Morse emerged as something of an anomaly. Quiet, patient, and so original that no one knew what box to put him in. While his peers studied to follow the rules, Morse broke them all. He didn't believe in musical boundaries, refused to separate jazz from rock or classical from bluegrass. In his mind, everything flowed together, like rivers merging into one ocean. During open jam sessions, he could shift from a complex, Bach-inspired arpeggio to a bluegrass groove, then explode into a dry, cutting rock riff, all within a single composition. Professors called him the guy who doesn't know how to stop, while students could only sit in stunned silence when he played. It was at Miami that Steve formed Three, an instrumental band with no vocals, no choruses, just sonic conversations between guitar, bass, and drums. They weren't chasing the market. They were chasing experience. Their first campus performances drew crowds of both students and professors stepping out of class to listen. Three wasn't just a band, it was a statement. Music didn't need words, only honesty. From those jam sessions came the seed of something bigger, Dixie Dregs, an instrumental band bold enough to defy every commercial rule. In that group, Steve Morse wasn't just a guitarist. He was a composer and an architect, building musical structures as intricate as classical works, yet bursting with the raw energy of rock. Some of Three's early demos would later evolve into the core of the Dregs' debut album, Free Fall, 1977. When the track Refried Funky Chicken played in one of the university's music labs, people knew something unusual was happening. A sound without borders, not made for the masses, but destined to change how the world listened to the guitar. No one at the time, not even Steve Morse himself, could have imagined that those humble recordings would mark the beginning of a journey spanning half a century. But in that small room at the University of Miami, surrounded by tangled cables and aging amplifiers, a legend was quietly being born. One that would forever redefine what it means to be a genius in music. In 1975, Steve Morse and his close friend Andy West officially formed Dixie Dregs, a band with a strange name meaning the remnants, or the leftovers. But for Morse, it wasn't an expression of modesty, it was a declaration. Their music, he said, was for those patient enough to find beauty in what the world had already discarded. While America was dancing to disco and raging in the punk revolution, the men of Dixie Dregs swam against the current, playing music with no singer, no lyrics, and no formula. In 1976, they independently recorded The Great Spectacular, a daring demo that left record executives scratching their heads, unsure which genre it belonged to. Tracks like Wages of Weirdness and Refried Funky Chicken sounded like a wild conversation between jazz, rock, and classical music, where every instrument told its own story, yet somehow merged into a single, inseparable voice. The compositions were complex, the time signatures constantly shifting, and Morse's guitar technique stunned everyone. Precise as Bach, yet burning with the raw fire of Southern rock. A year later, Capricorn Records, the same label that launched the Allman Brothers Band, took a gamble on them. In 1977, the debut album Free Fall was released. 11 tracks, all written by Steve Morse, blended classical architecture with the untamed energy of the American South. Holiday opened with the serenity of a forest morning before erupting into razor-sharp riffs. Refried Funky Chicken was a quirky funk experiment where Morse seemed to toy with the guitar as if it were an extension of his own nervous system. The album failed commercially, but within the music community, Steve Morse was hailed as a sound architect, a man who could turn technique into emotion and make the guitar speak an entirely new language. Free Fall didn't sell, but it made true musicians bow their heads in respect. The mainstream wasn't ready for Steve Morse, but he didn't stop, because just a year later, that very band, the so-called Leftovers, would make the global music world fall silent in awe. That was when the real game began. In 1978, Dixie Dregs returned with their second album, What If? A milestone that proved Steve Morse was no longer just an experimental guitarist, but a genuine composer. If Free Fall had been a rough sketch full of wild ideas, What If was the finished masterpiece, where every structure and modulation was mathematically precise yet deeply human. Morse fused gritty Southern rock with classical sophistication, turning each track into a journey of its own. Odyssey began with a tender melody before exploding into a miniature symphony. Take It Off the Top radiated Southern freedom and joy, while Ice Cakes was a showcase of breathtaking speed and accuracy. The music of What If was no longer just for technicians. It truly reached the heart. When the band performed at the Montreux Jazz Festival that same year, European audiences witnessed an instrumental performance so powerful that the entire hall stood after every solo. Steve Morse, once dismissed as the misfit of the disco era, had now commanded the attention of the global guitar elite. But fate, as always, had its own rhythm. Just as their success peaked, Capricorn Records collapsed in 1979, leaving Dixie Dregs stranded without a label. No contract, no promotion, no funding. The band suddenly found themselves in free fall. Morse began taking session gigs and side work in studios just to keep the band alive. What seemed like the end was, in truth, the quiet beginning of something greater. Because in that uncertain period, when everything appeared lost, Steve Morse was unknowingly preparing for the greatest turning point of his career. When Arista Records signed Dixie Dregs, it seemed like a new chapter was finally opening. But the price of entering the major label system was simple. They had to become more listenable, a phrase Steve Morse despised above all others. The label wanted a singer, wanted choruses, wanted to turn a bold instrumental fusion band into something that could fit neatly on the radio. Morse didn't argue. He simply moved his music forward, complying just enough to survive, while fiercely protecting its soul. In 1980, they released Dregs of the Earth, an album that marked a truce between technique and emotion. It was still entirely instrumental, but the melodies were warmer, clearer, more accessible. And although it never charted, it earned the band a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Instrumental Performance, a symbolic victory for musicians once dismissed as too uncommercial. In 1981, they followed up with Unsung Heroes, where Morse revealed a new level of maturity in blending complex fusion with classic rock sensibilities. Tracks like Cruise Control and Blood-Sucking Leeches still brimmed with technical brilliance, but now carried grooves that even casual listeners could nod along to. The band was inching closer to the public, without surrendering its identity. By 1982, Industry Standard arrived, their most ambitious project yet, featuring guest appearances by renowned artists such as Steve Howe, Yes, and Doane Perry, Jethro Tull. It was one of the rare times Morse experimented with vocals on select tracks, creating a balance between intricate structure and melodic accessibility. The album was hailed by Guitar Player magazine as Best Guitar Album of the Year, and Morse himself entered legend status. For 5 consecutive years, 1982, 1986, he was voted Best Overall Guitarist, standing alongside titans like Steve Howe and Eric Johnson, icons of technique and creativity. In 1980, they released Dregs of the Earth, an album that marked a truce between technique and emotion. It was still entirely instrumental, but the melodies were warmer, clearer, more accessible. And although it never charted, it earned the band a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Instrumental Performance, a symbolic victory for musicians once dismissed as too uncommercial. In 1981, they followed up with Unsung Heroes, where Morse revealed a new level of maturity in blending complex fusion with classic rock sensibilities. Tracks like Cruise Control and Blood-Sucking Leeches still brimmed with technical brilliance, but now carried grooves that even casual listeners could nod along to. The band was inching closer to the public, without surrendering its identity. By 1982, Industry Standard arrived, their most ambitious project yet, featuring guest appearances by renowned artists such as Steve Howe, Yes, and Doane Perry, Jethro Tull. It was one of the rare times Morse experimented with vocals on select tracks, creating a balance between intricate structure and melodic accessibility. The album was hailed by Guitar Player magazine as Best Guitar Album of the Year, and Morse himself entered legend status. For 5 consecutive years, 1982, 1986, he was voted Best Overall Guitarist, standing alongside titans like Steve Howe and Eric Johnson, icons of technique and creativity. But behind the accolades, reality was far less kind. The albums still didn't sell. Mainstream audiences continued to find their music too difficult, and Arista lost patience. The contract was terminated, and the band quietly dissolved. No farewell tour, no press statement, no noise. Steve Morse, who had just reached the pinnacle of recognition among guitarists, was suddenly staring into the vast emptiness called the music industry. He withdrew from the spotlight, choosing instead to teach, compose, and record music for himself, as if to prove that true art doesn't need a stage to exist. And in those quiet, introspective years, an unexpected invitation from a band thought long dead would soon pull Steve Morse back into the light and forever change the history of rock. After a brief period teaching guitar and composing independently for small film projects, Steve Morse received an unexpected invitation in 1986 to join Kansas, replacing veteran songwriter Kerry Livgren. By then, Kansas was no longer the legendary band of Carry On Wayward Son or Dust in the Wind. They were a drifting ship, stranded between the tides of synthpop and MTV. Record labels had turned their backs, audiences had forgotten them, and the remaining members were exhausted, unsure where they were heading. Morse's arrival was like a strange new wind. He didn't try to be a savior. He simply sat down, picked up his guitar, and began writing. In a small studio in Atlanta, he and the band created Power, 1986, a blend of traditional classic rock and modern melodic spirit. The hit single All I Wanted, co-written by Morse, became Kansas's first top 20 Billboard hit in years. Gone were the philosophical or rebellious overtones of the past. This was a tender love song, soaring in melody, yet still rich with Kansas's signature harmonic sophistication. With that song, Steve Morse didn't just write a hit. He restored the heartbeat of a dying band. 2 years later came In the Spirit of Things, 1988, a concept album produced by Bob Ezrin, the legendary mind behind Pink Floyd's The Wall. Inspired by a devastating historical flood in the small town of Neosho Falls, the record was both grand and deeply human. Under Morse's hand, Kansas's sound became more cinematic, more layered. His guitar lines now carried the tone of storytelling. Though it failed commercially, In the Spirit of Things is often regarded by critics as Kansas's last true artistic statement before the band's next breakup. Morse's mastery of arrangement, his discipline, and his tireless work ethic had saved Kansas, at least in spirit. He wasn't the star of the show. He was the stabilizer, the one who kept the ship afloat. But by 1989, just as things seemed to settle, Steve Morse left, not out of conflict, but because his heart no longer belonged to safe music. He founded the Steve Morse Band, returning to pure instrumental compositions, long, intricate, wordless pieces. He also launched a prolific solo career, each album like a fragment of his soul, reflecting a different shade of who he was. The Introduction, 1984, and Stand Up, 1985, had already laid the foundation for his solo reputation. Featuring guest musicians such as Peter Frampton and Eric Johnson, these albums became showcases of controlled virtuosity wrapped in unrestrained spirit. Tracks like Cruise Missile and General Lee burst with energy, precision, and structural elegance, mathematical in logic yet emotionally vivid, as if Morse were narrating his own life through sound. In the following years, he went further still. High-tension wires, 1989, and Southern Steel, 1991, expanded his sonic universe, blending country, jazz, and technical rock into pieces that were both complex and warm. On Southern Steel, the slide guitar echoed the soul of the American South, the land of his birth, and the one his heart always returned to. The pinnacle of this era came with Coast to Coast, 1992, hailed by critics as a love letter to American music. From country melodies to blues rhythms and jazz phrasing, everything intertwined within Morse's distinctive playing style. As precise as an engineer, yet as heartfelt as a poet. By this time, Steve Morse was more than a performer. He was a teacher. Invited to lecture at the Guitar Institute of Technology, GIT, he shared his philosophy. Music isn't about showing off technique. It's about telling the story of the heart. Outside of music, few knew he was also a licensed commercial pilot, a seemingly small fact that revealed everything about him. Steve Morse needed the sky to balance freedom with responsibility. No one could have predicted that this quiet, self-contained man, seemingly content to live beyond the spotlight, would, just a few years later, step into one of rock's most legendary bands, replacing one of the most iconic guitarists in history, and make the world remember the name Steve Morse. In 1994, when Ritchie Blackmore left Deep Purple in the middle of the Battle Rages on tour, the entire rock world was shaken. The legendary band stood on the verge of collapse. They had lost their founder, their spirit, and the shadow that had loomed over them for decades. In that moment when no one else dared to step into such an impossible role, one name surfaced: Steve Morse. A guitarist with no scandals, no noise, only flawless technique and an unbroken musical soul. From the very first audition, Morse left Ian Gillan and Roger Glover speechless. He didn't replicate Blackmore's iconic riffs note for note. He rewrote them in his own style, lighter, richer in harmony, breathing with the openness of jazz and the complexity of progressive rock. For Morse, the goal wasn't to replace Blackmore. It was to save Deep Purple by giving it a new soul. The result was Perpendicular, 1996, an album that marked a rebirth in Deep Purple's history. Gone were the feuds, the ghosts of Smoke on the Water. In their place was a sound full of vitality, fresh yet true to the band's essence. The standout track, Sometimes I Feel Like Screaming, co-written by Morse, became the anthem of the new era, hailed by fans as a beautiful confession of loneliness amid the storm of rock. The song began with a gentle breath and erupted into a soaring climax, featuring Morse's solos, sharp, lyrical, and heartbreakingly emotional. It wasn't just virtuosity anymore. It was the voice of a man who had quietly endured failure and now stood at the summit, not to defeat anyone, but to prove that music can still be reborn from ruin. No one called him Blackmore's replacement anymore. After Perpendicular, Steve Morse became the man who resurrected Deep Purple. Following that triumph, Morse kept pushing forward. With Abandon, 1998, he helped steer Deep Purple into even bolder territory, modern, intense, and alive. Morse wasn't just the lead guitarist. He was now a principal songwriter. Tracks like Any Fuel Know That and Seventh Heaven revealed a perfect balance between traditional metallic riffing and the intricate rhythmic structure only Morse could craft. The sound was sharper, braver, distinct. Deep Purple of the 90s was no longer a relic of nostalgia, but a living, evolving organism. By the early 2000s, when many believed the band had run its course, Morse once again proved otherwise. With Bananas 2003, he infused new colors, blending funk and pop rock to create tracks like House of Pain and I Got Your Number, catchy yet technically rich. 2 years later, Rapture of the Deep, 2005, reaffirmed that Deep Purple didn't need to survive on its past. They could still release fresh, daring, and powerful music. Morse's playing had become more reflective, deeply emotional, and refined, as though he had completely merged into the band's DNA without losing his identity. Over the next 2 decades, Steve Morse maintained an almost superhuman pace, performing more than 100 shows each year, from Europe to South America, from Japan to Australia. On stage, he always stood to the right, quiet blonde hair falling across his face, never seeking the spotlight. But the moment his Stratocaster sang, the audience knew. This was the sound of a man both preserving history and rewriting it with his own hands. As Deep Purple entered the 2010s, many assumed the band lived only on the memory of Smoke on the Water. Yet Morse quietly scripted a whole new chapter. The modern trilogy. Now What? 2013, Infinite, 2017, and Whoosh, 2020. Critics dubbed them the final chronicles of Deep Purple, not only because they closed an era, but because they embodied the full maturity of Morse's musicianship and spirit. On Now What? Morse delivered a sound both classic and contemporary, as if Deep Purple had rediscovered itself through wiser eyes. Infinite, 2017, reminded listeners the fire still burned. Tracks like Time for Bedlam and The Surprising carried a haunting grandeur, where Morse's guitar spoke like a quiet farewell to the band's youth. And by Whoosh, 2020, he had reached a rare serenity, no longer playing for speed or showmanship, but to tell stories, bridging generations of fans with sincerity and warmth. Throughout nearly 30 years, Steve Morse never sought the spotlight. He was the hinge, the only man who could unite 2 worlds once thought irreconcilable: the wild chaos of the Blackmore era and the calm wisdom of the modern age. Deep Purple had endured countless lineup changes and noisy departures, but only once in history did a member leave, not out of anger, not out of conflict, but out of love. In 2022, Steve Morse announced his departure to care for his wife, who was battling terminal cancer. The news left the rock world silent with emotion. There was no scandal, no blame. Only a man choosing to stand beside the person he loved in her final days. Deep Purple's official statement read, "Steve Morse is the keeper of the band's soul." And that line was true, not only of his music, but of his life itself. Quiet, loyal, and always knowing when to let go. To hold on to what truly matters. When the stage lights went out, Steve Morse returned to being an ordinary man, quiet, introverted, and a little awkward in conversation. That's why few people ever suspected he had lived through a love story that spanned decades, one as deep and aching as the way he played guitar. The woman was Janine Morse, who would later become his wife, a simple love, yet powerful enough to make him walk away from Deep Purple. They met in the early 1980s when Steve was still a struggling guitarist, experimenting with obscure fusion projects, and Janine was an art student in Florida. They first crossed paths at a small Dixie Dregs performance, where Janine, captivated by the abstract yet sincere music, approached him afterward and said, "Your music makes me feel at peace." For Morse, that meant more than any applause. It came from someone who didn't talk about technique or fame, only about feeling his heart through sound. Their love didn't flare up. It unfolded like a slow composition, each note, each pause, each silence carrying weight. They married quietly, without lavish ceremony, simply 2 people choosing to walk together through life's longest stretches. For years, Janine accompanied Morse on tour, standing quietly backstage, tending to his meals and rest. When he practiced for hours, she would sit in the next room reading, saying, "That sound makes me feel like I'm home." They had 2 sons, both raised amid music and art, but never pushed to follow in their father's footsteps. Morse once told friends that family was the only place where I never have to prove anything. At home, he wasn't a guitar legend, just a man who loved cooking, playing with the dog, and telling clumsy jokes. But the marriage wasn't always easy. The life of a touring musician meant they rarely spent more than a few weeks together. Year after year, Morse was on the road over 200 days, from Europe to South America to Asia. Rushed video calls, canceled vacations, and nights when Janine stayed home alone with sick children, all of it slowly carved silent cracks in their relationship. They didn't argue. They simply grew quieter. And sometimes that silence hurt more than words ever could. In 2019, during Deep Purple's Long Goodbye tour, Janine was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Steve's world collapsed. For nearly 3 years, he balanced life between the stage and the hospital, touring by day, rushing home whenever he could. When her condition worsened, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He left Deep Purple, something no one had ever done, not out of conflict, but out of love. Morse devoted all his time to caring for Janine at their home in Florida until the very end. He never spoke to the press, never made an emotional public statement. Only one short line appeared in the band's announcement. "Steve will step away from the tour to care for a family member who is ill." But everyone knew. It was the hardest choice a musician could make. To leave the music, to hold on to what was left of his heart. When Janine passed away, Steve disappeared from public life for months. No concerts, no interviews, only quiet recordings made in the small room that had once been her art studio. Those pieces, soft as breath and sorrowful as wind across strings, became his way of saying goodbye. People call Steve Morse a guitar genius, but perhaps what makes him truly great has nothing to do with speed or technique. It lies in this: even when the world was in his hands, he chose love over glory. And in the silence of that loss, his music became more honest than ever before. After that personal devastation, Steve's body began to rebel against the passion that had sustained him all his life. Chronic arthritis eroded the cartilage in his joints, especially his wrists and little finger, until bone scraped against bone, sending searing pain through his hands. But he never put the guitar down. Even when every note felt like a blade cutting into his flesh, Morse kept performing, kept touring, kept playing each note with unshakable endurance. "Playing is no longer a joy. It's a battle," he said calmly in one rare interview, as if describing an ordinary fact of life. To keep going, he invented a custom muting device, completely reinvented his technique, switching from pick to finger style, redistributing finger movements to reduce pressure on his joints. He no longer chased speed or flash, but every note he played carried new weight, as if each touch of the string were a vow against time itself. On stage, the audience never saw his pain. They only saw a silver-haired man, quiet and humble, fighting his battle through music rather than complaint. Few know that before illness struck, Steve Morse was a part-time commercial pilot in the late 1980s. Flying for him wasn't a hobby. It was a form of balance. "It's like meditation," he once said. Among the clouds, he found the same sensations as with the guitar. Total control, total freedom, total solitude. When he's not performing, Morse teaches advanced guitar classes, writes instructional books, and joins nonprofit projects, inspiring younger generations. with his lessons on perseverance and honesty in art. He doesn't drink, smoke, or use any substances. His life remains as disciplined as a pilot's and as simple as a farmer's. An ordinary man in an extraordinary world. To his friends and bandmates, Steve Morse is the kindest man in Deep Purple, the one who never raises his voice, never claims credit, never complains. Just a man who works, plays, and smiles quietly. A great artist who needs no myth, only the strength to play one more note with all his heart. In recent years, while many of his peers have chosen a quiet retirement, Steve Morse has continued to live to the rhythm of creation, only now in a different space, quieter, more personal, yet still burning with passion. From 2023 to 2024, he spent most of his time at home in Ocala, Florida, composing and experimenting with new forms of art. The result was 2 series of abstract paintings, Northern Lights and Plasma Channel, in which he blended color and sound, with each brush stroke corresponding to a frequency, a vibration, a tone. The art world called it music made visible, while fans described it as sound turned into light. Not stopping there, Morse collaborated with Katya Arts to create jewelry crafted from old guitar strings, the very ones that once rang out during Deep Purple and Flying Colors performances. The bracelets and pendants were affectionately dubbed music turned into memory, not for their material value, but because each string carried a fragment of the soul of the songs that made history. In 2024, Morse released an extensive guitar instruction book, accompanied by over 100 recorded demonstrations performed by himself. Without marketing or publicity, the professional guitar community hailed it as a treasure of technique, a work that encapsulated his entire life's craft, precise as a textbook, yet as emotional as a wordless memoir. By 2025, in his 70s, Steve Morse continued to surprise. He recorded a guest guitar solo for Save Me, a song by young Croatian rock band King's Point, a refined collaboration across generations. That same year, he taught at Guitar Workshop Plus in Nashville, not as a celebrity guest, but as a true teacher, sitting beside students, guiding them through phrasing, picking, and the subtle breathing behind every note he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Even in his 70s, Morse still practices every day, still plays, still creates, as if the concept of spiritual retirement simply doesn't exist for him. Like every note he has ever played, his life never truly stops. It merely shifts to a different key, deeper, quieter, but resonating to the very end of the song. Steve Morse's legacy doesn't live on chart rankings or in posters hanging on dorm walls. It exists in how musicians play after him, in every carefully shaped phrase, in every note struck with absolute respect for sound. After more than half a century of dedication, he leaves behind not just recordings, but a philosophy that music isn't for showing off, it's for connecting, for healing, for proving that subtlety can be stronger than noise. From the early days of Dixie Dregs, when he dared to blend jazz, classical, and bluegrass during the punk era, to reviving Kansas from decline and keeping Deep Purple alive and evolving for nearly 30 years, Morse has always done one thing. He never compromised for the sake of ease. Every project he touched became a lesson in discipline, persistence, and artistic integrity, even when it brought no financial reward. He is one of only 3 people in history inducted into the Guitar Player Hall of Fame after winning Best Overall Guitarist 5 years in a row. John Petrucci calls him the man who enlightened modern guitarists. Sean Lane described him as an artist who transcends all technical limits. And his Deep Purple bandmates put it simply, without Steve, we would have fallen apart long ago. Yet what truly makes Steve Morse's legacy endure isn't praise, It's his attitude toward life itself. Calm amid chaos, genuine amid the artificial world of show business. He has lost bands, lost his beloved wife, and even lost the full strength of his hands, but never his will to create. Now, in his 70s, he still wakes early, plays new melodies, jots notes into a small notebook, and tells his students, "Music doesn't end, it just changes shape." And perhaps that is Steve Morse's secret, a man who never tried to become a legend, yet through silence, devotion, and enduring love, became someone the rock world will never forget. Because sometimes, the ones who don't seek recognition are the very people who make music immortal. And if you've ever heard a melody that made your heart slow down and feel lighter, somewhere in that sound, Steve Morse might be playing. If you've ever loved a song so much you had to close your eyes to truly hear it, let Steve Morse's story remind you. Real music doesn't live in the noise. It lives in the heart that dares to be quiet and still burn. What do you think of his choice to walk away from glory for love to keep playing through pain? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we continue exploring the great souls who turned pain into immortal music.